All right, well, welcome to Mastering the Metaphor with Impact Psychology. I'm pushing buttons to make sure that it's recording because I have concerns. Let's hope that it is working. So it's right at 6, so I imagine some people will be joining us a little bit late because life is like that. Oh, good. It is showing that it's recording. And I'm just going to ask if you have any questions that you want to chat about. You're welcome to post them to everyone on the Zoom group chat. And then Margaret McKelvey is also our other Impact Colorado person who can answer some of those questions as well. I get rather focused on the presentation. So any questions before we get started? No? Okay, great. Well, welcome to Mastering the Metaphor. I am super excited to be sharing this with you guys. It's a win-win situation because I get to practice. I have presented this at a couple of other conferences, but it's been a couple of years, so it's always nice to get some feedback. And I added some new information since the last time that I did it. So it's really, I'm very grateful that you're all here. I know that our schedules are all very busy. And so I appreciate that you made the choice to come and sit with us. So I'm going to get started. I am in Colorado, and behind these shades, if you can see me, is a beautiful mountain range, but the sun glare is a little strong. So in a little bit, I'll put that down so we can see it. And obviously, we don't need CE credit for this session. I wish we could do that, but we couldn't do it on short term, but that's what'll happen if you're there. I don't have any relevant financial disclosures. The cartoon, if you're on the phone, it says I prefer to think of it as added value, 2 + 2 = 5. I feel really grateful for this community. I'm amazed that we're sitting here having a conversation with people from all over the world, and it's just such an honor to be a part of ACBS, and an honor to be a part of Impact Psychology Colorado. We're long-time acties and a new collective here in Colorado, and we're super excited about being a part of this community. All right, so the goals of the workshop, we'll talk about the science of metaphors and the application of metaphors in clinical practice, and then we'll look at some video and audio of ACT therapists using metaphors. I tried to have as many different people in the video clips because we know that such a huge part of ACT in the clinical room is personal style, and so many people do such an amazing job and it looks so very different. So I tried to draw upon that diversity, and then the optimal guidelines that we think of and how to best use the metaphors in the clinical practice. So this is a picture, if you're on the phone, of some people jumping off the cliff, and I just thought this would be a good way to remember, the main goal in ACT is committed action. And specifically, we're looking to promote behavior that's more workable and more flexible. And in order to do that, we ask a lot of our clients. We ask them when we're doing metaphors and experiential exercises to be vulnerable, to be confused, to be willing. And so in this spirit, I just want to invite all of us tonight to kind of adopt that posture and do our best to be vulnerable and willing around what we're talking about. At the end of this, I'm going to try to do a group metaphor. I don't know how it'll work, but we'll give it a shot. It works really well in person and in groups. So I'll be asking for a volunteer. So even now, just notice whether or not you might be willing to do something like that. It's a metaphor where everyone would participate, but one person would be spearheading it. So just think about that and think about immediately how that impacts us and what that's like when clients sit with us and we ask them to do these sorts of things. Well, I don't have anyone to give me empathic head nods. All right, I can work with it. So some of the power of metaphors is the ubiquity. The research shows that we utter one metaphor for every 10 to 20 words, which is upward of 6 metaphors a minute. Sorry, I'm just going to let Carrie in. Oh, welcome, Carrie. We're so glad to have you. So I actually, when I was first doing this, I listened to a couple of podcasts by some of the greats, and I started counting the metaphors. And this is not an exaggeration. We use them on a regular basis. It's really it's everywhere. The other thing we know about metaphors is that it can increase retention by 40%. And some more recent research around the clinical experience is that clients are more likely to remember what their clinician said if they use a metaphor. So there's a lot of power in retention and in this ubiquitous nature of metaphors. Oh, sorry, I have to switch back to the screen. So I want to show, this is about a 4-minute clip, and it should be loud enough for anyone on the phone to hear it as well. A clip by Robert Sapolsky. He is a neuroscientist and a professor of biology at Stanford. You may know him. He is pretty famous for a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which was pretty popular back in the day, about sort of how humans manage chronic stress. But this is a specific clip on how metaphors work in psychology and in the brain. And I think it's really relevant for what we want to know and learn about metaphors.
But we use it uniquely, now looking at realms where there is simply no precedent. Nothing else out there does the sort of stuff that we do. And giving 2 examples here. First one is personified in the personification on this. These are 2 quotes from this wonderful book by Ruth Gendler called The Book of Qualities, which each page is this personification of a different emotion. And they're wonderful, they're great. And what you have are these, like,
oh, sorry. Sorry, I was trying to let somebody in. Let's see if I just hit pause.
Species has out there. And we can suddenly understand all sorts of things. We know that when the captain of the ship is asking for more than just hands, when he's asking for the hands to be on deck, we know that the hands represent something. We understand that Kafka's Metamorphosis was not a book about entomology. We understand that a piece of cloth can represent deep, deep societal values, and it could be deeply offensive if somebody else is trying to burn that flag. And we also understand that the right person putting the right collection of ink on a piece of paper, and what that music stands for, is Napoleon getting his ass kicked outside of Moscow. And what we also understand is the phrase Napoleon getting kicked there outside of Moscow, what it actually stands for, thousands and thousands of soldiers dying cold and hungry far from home. We can do things that are astonishing and unique in the realm of metaphor. What's most interesting about it is how our brain processes it. Because we have, in some ways, a classic mammalian brain, but we've got to handle something utterly unprecedented here, the notion of metaphors and symbols. How does the brain do it? It turns out in a very unexpected way. Okay. First example, you, and in this case, you could be virtually any mammal on Earth, you have just eaten a piece of food that is rotten, it is spoiled, it is fetid, it is, God, it tastes absolutely disgusting. And in the process of spitting it out, there's a part of your brain that activates something called the insular cortex, which has a lot to do with gustatory processing. It tells you when you've just eaten something disgusting. It also activates if you smell something disgusting. It also activates uniquely in us if we think about something we find to be gustatorially disgusting. And suddenly you can have people activating their insula, usually in brain scanning machines, when they contemplate eating all sorts of stuff in your particular culture counts as disgusting. And this is all mediated by this part of the brain, the insula, which is just underneath the surface of one of the cortices there, and it's totally cool, and it's connected with gustatory, and that's how it works in mammals. But then you could contemplate being disgusted by something else. We contemplate being disgusted by what humans are willing to do to each other. And we wallow in it, and we think about it, and we come up with ideas like, just hearing about this makes me sick to my stomach. Knowing people can do things like that makes me want to puke, makes me feel queasy. I just have a dirty taste in my mouth since here. And we have a metaphor with it. And when we are contemplating moral disgust, the same part of the brain activates. You sit somebody down and get them to recount a moral failing of theirs, and this part of the brain activates. We not only do gustatory disgust, we do moral disgust with the same part of the brain. How could that be? Because when we evolved this capacity for moral disgust, we didn't come up with a new brain region. We just forced this insula to expand its portfolio, and in some way the brain handled this very abstract concept in this totally literal way. This is another version of eating disgusting spoiled food. Certain concreteness there in how the brain handles it. Next example.
So I think that is a really interesting piece when we're sitting in the room with people and they're feeling this visceral experience, and it's a psychological moment to understand that there's a physiological component too. Really very interesting. And this is a smaller bit of a longer piece. If you're interested, he goes on with a little bit more about trauma too, which is very interesting, but I'm going to keep moving for our purposes. So I have to go back.
But we use it uniquely
to our screen. So the other thing that we're really starting to understand is that on a deeper level, in addition to this physiology of the brain, that we're realizing that metaphors are not simply just a specialist tool, but they're actually the very building blocks of language in general. And they're really starting to conceptualize metaphors as this common language and common experience that we all share as a collective consciousness. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, my mind was blown by that. That was really a big aha moment to think, wow, this is embedded in our language. This is more than just a learning tool, a teaching tool. This is a part of how we are connected to each other as humans. So I'm big on graphics. Thank you to Kelly Kerner for teaching me how to present a PowerPoint that's not death by bullets. And when I got this picture, then I realized that all of my pictures are metaphors too. So one of the things that you'll see throughout this PowerPoint is that there's metaphors embedded throughout everything that we're saying. And since that's going to help us with retention, I'm all for it. So it's not a surprise that metaphors are showing up in CBS practice. I'm just going to close out these participants. That's bothering me. And so metaphors in CBS practice, they're thematic stories with an intention of exploring psychological flexibility. And even that's a metaphor, psychological flexibility. Metaphors in CBS are planned and practiced, and they're designed with a specific intention of communicating possibility. CBS is not the first to incorporate metaphors. It precedes third wave contextual therapies, goes way back to insight-oriented and dynamic theories. I think as early as we had the Therapeutic Alliance, we recognized how powerful they are. And across all theoretical orientations, metaphors are beneficial specifically for accessing really painful and or difficult material. So if you can't see this, the metaphor is the elephant in the room. And I love this picture because the parts of the elephant in the room are awkwardness, avoidance, reluctance, denial, etc. So we use them when we're really wanting to get to this deeper level that we're really struggling to access, because it's frankly very hard for us. It's painful, it's difficult. Our brain is designed to push back and avoid. So what I want to do now here is just show a YouTube video of the Chinese finger trap metaphor. It is a pretty classic one in ACT. It has some subtitles, so if it's your language, then that's fine. If not, it speaks in English as well.
The Chinese finger trap is a great illustration of life. I put my fingers in here, and they're stuck. I feel trapped. And the reason I'm trapped is because I keep trying to control or exert influence over something that I don't have control over. The Chinese finger trap is in control. So as I accept that, I can now take my focus on trying to control that which I don't have control over, live life on life's terms, in other words, and focus on what I do have control over, which is freedom, and which is what I want. I want to feel and be free. And as I focus on freedom, then I allow things to happen and do things consistent with freedom, and I become free. So consider the Chinese finger trap. The next time you feel stuck, whether it be drug addiction or some other problem in one's life, accepting the fact that I'm not in control allows me to exercise focus on what I really want, and then allow things to happen, do things consistently. Chinese finger trap.
So that's classic and a favorite because you also have an experiential element to it. In addition to just using language, you're also getting the physical experience. And it's always interesting to watch somebody who knows how it works and somebody who doesn't know how it works. Invariably, regardless of whether they've seen it before, they stick their finger in and then they get stuck. And then they have a sensory association as well. So a lot of the times, as much as possible, we use experiential metaphors to create not just a range of verbal associations, but also sensory associations. So feeling stuck is a literal experience and not just a mental experience. So what did you notice? It's likely that you noticed, a range of verbal and sensory associations. And then also an opportunity to examine perspectives. This one was a little bit more direct, a little less curious and open kind of curious posture, but he was also asking us to think about perspectives. How do I live my life? And then it also provides an alternative possibility of action. So the light bulb goes on, do I want to do something different? So a lot's happening in a very short amount of time. So let's look at the actual components of a metaphor and break this down even more. When we deconstruct the metaphor literally means the transfer of symbols. So we're using language as symbols and we're transferring information back and forth. We've got three pieces of the metaphor. We've got the topic. The topic is the issue of exploration. Then we have the vehicle. The vehicle is the network of knowledge that already exists. And then we have shared ground. And the shared ground are the questions for consideration. So if we look at that specific metaphor with this deconstruction, what we have is the topic. Do I struggle in life? How do I live my life? We have the vehicle. What are these mechanics of the toy? And then we have the shared ground. Do I surrender? Do I fight? Do I consider an alternative behavior? So we are getting all of this information through topic, vehicle, and shared ground. So here comes the big one. The first time I saw this slide, I found this pretty overwhelming. This is an RFT slide from Yvonne Barnes-Holmes' presentation on metaphors. She's amazing, and she's knows about everything on this slide, but the first time I saw this slide, I felt very overwhelmed. But she used this specific metaphor. Struggling with life is like struggling with the Chinese finger cuffs. And for our purposes, what I want to do is deconstruct this very slowly and very respectfully, because it can be overwhelming. So instead of thinking about it like this, let's think about it like this. Let's clean it up a little bit. We've got the metaphor at the top. Struggling with life is like struggling with the Chinese finger cuffs. We've got the topic. The topic is the struggle itself. And then the vehicle is the experience of the finger cuffs. And what's so lovely about that experiential metaphor is if somebody has never had that toy before, never seen it, and doesn't have that network, they very quickly gain the network by playing with the toy. They put their finger in it and inevitably they get stuck and they do what is the intuitive move of trying to struggle to get out. So the shared ground is this possibility. We're aiming for psychological flexibility, and the shared ground is entirely up to the client. Even though we have an intention when we go in to the therapy room, when we're doing metaphors and when we're adopting a curious open stance, we really want to let the shared ground be whatever the client says, even if the client engages in further struggle. And that's really important because we're not dictating, we're asking people to open up and consider other possibilities. All right, I have a couple of people that want to get in, so I'm just going to go and let them know. Okay. So here's another one to think about. This one's rather amusing because Russ Harris is, I don't know where he is doing this video, but it is Russ Harris talking about the metaphor of hands and thoughts. So let's take a look at this one.
musicians riff. Essentially, they jam on musical ideas and musical concepts. You can do the same thing with act.
Yeah, I guess what I'm what I'm going to do is just back to the nutshell metaphor and how we can use them to tease out the content. And first of all, we're going to have a look at fusion, and I'm going to take you through what's called the hands of thought, because you'll see the overlap. So if I can take this, I want you to imagine that your hands each thoughts and place them together like the pages of a book. Okay. So these are all your thoughts. You know, it might be your worries, your anxieties, your stresses, all of those kind of unhelpful thoughts. Again, what I want you to do is ever so slowly bring your thoughts towards your face. Still, notice what happens as they get closer and closer until they're actually covering your eyes. Okay, so you're all caught up in your thoughts. Now, notice what your view is like. How much are you missing out on? And huge information coming into you. Imagine going around like this all day. What would it be like trying to act effectively, do the things that make you work? Trying to, cook dinner, drive a car, do the stuff that you thought would be pretty difficult, right? You're missing out. It's very difficult to act effectively. Ever so slowly lower your hands and notice what happens. Space between you and your thoughts increases. Notice your view of the room. Notice your view of my hairstyle. Kind of these designer label clothes here. And again, kind of notice now that you can engage in your life, do the things. And just pick up that your hands are still there. Your thoughts haven't disappeared. But you can just let them sit there. If there's something useful you can do with them, you can use them. If not, you let them sit there. So this is just a little metaphor for demonstrating just fusion and diffusion.
Which essentially expands your worldview and is what we need at that critical moment.
Yeah, and the nice thing again, in ACT, many people are kind of just make these thoughts go away, and often you can't make them go away, but there's a huge difference between having thoughts.
You've still got them, so you can point at people and say, it's your fault, my life is ruined.
Exactly. Exactly. Very, very important to be able to do that.
I'll never know why they felt the need to have that music in the background. But I love what he says about at the end, which is your hands are still there. I mean, this isn't about a control strategy. This is about a willingness of noticing how we manage distressing information. So if we use the same topic, vehicle, shared ground, the metaphor is if my hands were like my thoughts. The topic is what is my relationship with my thoughts? And the vehicle is how hands work, space, proximity, movement, moving them into the visual field, seeing how they interfere with other things that are important to us. And then shared ground, which we're hoping that the clients will come upon, but again, we want to be open to whatever they bring up, is do I get lost in my thoughts? Do I miss out on life as a result? And do I consider an alternative behavior? Because some people may choose to not consider an alternative behavior, but the intention of the metaphor is to at least raise this curiosity and this openness to trying something different. So I want to specifically focus now on this area of shared ground, because this is when we really want to start to think about this shared ground in the context of RFT. So one example of shared ground that we all have is relational frame theory. And relational frame theory, if you've never heard this term before, is this idea that we as humans can relationally frame or connect information based on reason and science. In these examples, these relational frames are examples of reason and science. So up in the left, we have comparison, better, worse, older, younger, we're comparing in a range. On the right, we have coordination and opposition, which is coordination would be an example of that is this frame that red fruit is an apple, but opposition would be this red fruit is not an apple. And being able to have that information will help you to figure out other information. If it's not an apple, what is it? Not all red fruit is an apple. Then on the bottom left, we have the temporal frame, which is the frame of time, now and then. And then on the bottom right, we have a causal frame, which is an if-then. If I speak slowly, then maybe you will understand what I'm trying to say. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just an introduction to the understanding that we all have this shared ground in this language when we use these frames to understand the world around us. In addition to relationally framing with reason and science, we also have relational framing with random choice. And this is known as arbitrary relational framing. And it's arbitrary not because it's unimportant, but because it's based on random choice rather than reason or system. So an example of that in the US, we have paper bills and we also have coins. Not sure if that's for me, but I'm not understanding it. So we have coins and we have this arbitrary relational frame where 10 cents is worth more than 5 cents, but the coin itself is smaller than the 5-cent coin. And this is very confusing to children who are on a concrete operational level, because they think that the nickel should be worth more than the dime. And then this is, this is an arbitrary relational frame that they have to learn through the system, that even though the dime is smaller, its worth is arbitrarily more. And from that, what we do is we can create bigger networks. So if you're looking at the slide and you can see that the dime is worth more than the nickel, even though the nickel is bigger than the dime, then we also can see that the dime is worth more than the penny. I'm sorry, but the penny is bigger than the dime, but smaller than the nickel. So we start to create all these relationships between all of these different objects and ideas in order to have this shared ground, this information that we all can understand, so that when I tell you what something costs, you can give me the right amount of money based on the arbitrary value, not just the size. So here's some more mind-blowing information. We can actually take just a few relational frames and we can create an entire network. This is the power of the human brain. So I have to believe that at this point, The Simpsons are an international phenom. But this next slide is a video of somebody's dissertation, and they're talking a little bit about this relational framework and creating a network. So let's take a look.
Relationship, which is a Simpsons set of relationships, that Homer, the dad, is older than the daughter Lisa. So there's our first relationship. The second relationship is one where Lisa, the oldest daughter, is going to be older than Maggie, the youngest daughter. So there's our second relationship. Our third relation is that Homer is going to be younger than his father, Abe. And finally, Abe is going to be younger than Monty Burns. So we established 4 different relationships. And what that provides for us is a kind of a network of relationships. And you can see the focus here was on Homer. You see how Homer, with that direct relationship where he was older than Lisa older than Maggie with a direct relationship, Homer younger than Abe, and Abe younger than Monty. You see those are our direct relationships. But then what happens is we create this network of other.
Yeah, so I cut him off because that was all I wanted him to say. I'm going to say it a little bit more. What's powerful about this is how much we can grow and expand our understanding of relationships based on very little data. And just to lock down some of the terms here,
relationship.
Those first 4 connections, which he called the direct relational frames, that's because they were given to us, they were directly provided, is using the relational frame of comparison, specifically comparing age, older and younger. And that these frames, these comparison frames, are non-arbitrary because they are based on the rules of age, and the rules of age are not arbitrary. They're based on chronological numbers. Now, I understand The Simpsons are arbitrary, but the frame of comparison is not. And the idea that we can figure out all those other arrows on our own without the direct information is called derived relationships. And derived just means gleaned or acquired, learned indirectly. And we're able to do that because our brain can say things like, if X is older than Y and Z is older than X, then this is how X and Z relate. And so this is a really powerful piece of our shared ground. And how this relates to metaphor is really interesting. So I can't do a presentation without Steve Hayes doing a metaphor. So this is Steve Hayes doing a metaphor of the chessboard, which is another classic. And he just does a remarkable job of getting really experiential with it as well. And what I love about this is he's really creating some awareness around these relational frames without ever using any of the jargon. He's not talking about derived or relational frames or anything like that. He's just talking, but he's talking about this shared ground in these relational frames. So let's take a look.
I'm going to do it with what has become a kind of act classic metaphor, in this case, the chessboard metaphor.
It'd be like a game of chess. Okay. The way chess works, it was originally done as a war game, is you have all these pieces that kind of lie like into teams, and they do battle. Let's say the white pieces and the black pieces, and each team hangs out together. So it's like that psychologically. Some of our feelings, memories, thoughts are the good team, and some of them are like the bad team, and they hang out together. Like this feeling of, or this thought that I'm not worthy hangs out. Negative feelings does not. Like,
I can't do this away, mother. Okay. You can't get this job because you don't have this, or you don't have that, or you can't get this individual and have them in a relationship because you're just.
And so, and they're kind of like buddies, right? Right. Like that thought, you really buy it. Pull this other one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and the same thing on the positive side. You're thinking well of yourself. Probably there's more pleasant memories that go with that. Right. The normal thing to do is to try to get one of those teams to win. Right? Well, let's nominate this team to win. So we'll battle that team. If it's really true that if you're not willing to have it, you've got it, what happens is that team just gets bigger. So as you sort of fight with, I'm not worthy, it becomes more central, it becomes more focused. In a way, you're buying it. Or otherwise, why are you fighting with it? Now, in that metaphor, suppose I were to say all these pieces are not you anyway. So where are you in there?
One of the nice things about act metaphors is they allow you to integrate things into a coherent whole without having to reason it all out intellectually. And what you're going to see here is that we can use that metaphor to integrate acceptance, diffusion, and a contextual or transcendent sense itself.
But see what you're doing when you're trying to push that thought away. You're actually like buying into it. Be kind of like if we literally had a board here. Okay, so let's say this is like consciousness. Let's say this.
I can't believe we just did that.
I'm not worthy. And there's other things laid on it. Like there's only two things that can happen here if you're going to be at this level. Hold what shows up and take the whole shooting match in the direction that you choose. When you're up there trying to do this, get this one off, that one there, you have to go from this level to this level. You got to take these things seriously. You got to take them literally. If this is the thought, I'm not worthy, once you're up there, you're in trouble.
Wow.
So there's that moment we talked about at the beginning where we ask clients to sort of be confused or be unwilling or to sit in the huh. And the huh is oftentimes, and certainly in this case, an indication of, being able to come into contact with an awareness of what is going on that level. So using the deconstruction piece again, the topic is, what is my relationship with myself and my meta-awareness The vehicle is how chess works, the sides, the rules for different pieces, the competition, the board. Just as a side note, I have managed to use this metaphor with people who have never heard of the game of chess, and just letting them know that it is a game of war with two sides is usually accurate enough, and then they can pull on the vehicle of other games where there is that type of a setup. And then the shared ground is, do I get fused with my thoughts? Does this create a problem? And do I consider an alternative behavior? I think the idea that there's even an alternative behavior to consider is part of what is so amazing about what Steve is doing. And I just can't imagine that I would ever be able to get away with what he does of blowing my nose and using that. But it has such a beautiful experiential moment, because even as you're watching it, and it goes back to that Sapolsky video, there's this like, ugh, you know, you're repelled. And that's that piece of that relational frame of, you know, thoughts of happiness are better than thoughts of anxiety or thoughts of depression. And to have that visceral disgust is a really lovely vehicle for the way that we also treat what's going on inside our minds. The other thing that Steve is doing there is also really valuable. He's attending to something else happening in the room besides just the relational frames. And that is the rules that this client has about the way he manages his difficult internal, or what we refer to in ACT as private events. We know that private events are all the things in our head, thoughts and urges and feelings and memories and sensations. And so in addition to the RFT, he's also really helping with, again, with only talking about the game of chess and blowing his nose on the Kleenex, to really uncover that there is this way of handling difficult information. And so that's really going and talking a little bit more about the topic. So let's talk a little bit under this rubric of topic about rule-governed behaviors, also known as RGBs. Rule-governed behaviors are something that Skinner came up with in the mid-60s. It's not something that ACBS came up with, but it's something that the RFT community has done this just brilliant job of parsing out on a more contextual level. So on its base level, it was just Skinner's understanding about how our rules govern our behaviors. Opposable thumbs in linguistic rules. These are our bragging rights. But what we have is a very personal experience about the way we navigate these rules. So RFT has identified 3 functional patterns that we look at for rule-governed behaviors, known as pliance, tracking, and augmenting. And that's why I love this little metaphor on the side if you're on the phone. The world is revolving around me, and it says, as a matter of fact, the world does revolve around me, because this is the personal element that we're looking at, with each client being individual and personal and what their rules are. And it is unique to their context, their history, their environment. So let's start with pliance. Pliance is also known as plies, and it comes from the root of compliance. And we've all gone to our Psych 101, we know about the value of compliance. It's based on compliance with rules that are socially supported. So pliance in different cultures is different. Plies are typically our first introduction to rules, so we typically hear them, you know, from our primary caregivers, people in our family. An example is eat your vegetables and fruits to stay healthy. And the idea there is that there's compliance because I want you to do this. I don't know whether I want to eat my veggies, but I might be willing to eat them, A, because I want to please you, or B, because I will get in trouble if I don't. It's really, I'm doing this because I'm being told to do it. Then we have tracking, also known as tracks. And tracks are behaviors based on rules that are reinforced by natural consequences in the environment. That's a mouthful. I'm just going to shorten it to, I want to do this. And so the idea is that now we have an internal experience. There are these natural consequences. If I eat my veggies, I feel better, or I practice the piano and my performance improves. Then these are natural consequences in my environment that's going to reinforce me to continue to follow the rules. So going back to that idea of eating your vegetables, or I see a typo here because I used to have put on your coat, it's cold outside. In this point, then, if I put on my coat because it's cold outside, or I eat my veggies because that'll keep me healthy, Is that pliance or is that tracking? And this is one where I don't think anyone's going to answer me, so I'm just going to keep talking. The answer is the contextual answer always, it depends. So the distinction is actually functional, not formal. And in fact, it's rather tricky because it could be some of both. Because if I'm eating the vegetables or putting on the coat because I want to be compliant and I want to make you happy, but I also have the natural consequence of I like the way it feels, then it's both. And so we think about, we're really thinking on this level of rules, you want me to do this and or I want to do this. So it's a little bit more sophisticated than plies because there is some natural consequences in the environment that are impacting our choices. Then we have augmenting or augmentals. That's my second typo of the night. And these are behaviors based on the implied consequences specified in the rules. It's another mouthful. Another way of thinking about that is I want to be like that, or I want to have that. So I will do this, or I will be like this in order to be like that or to have that. So it's a little bit more of a thinking process. So the example is, if you eat vegetables, you will be a big and strong boy. What do you want to eat? So we're relating what we know that person wants and how we're going to feel about that compliance, and or what I want or what kind of natural consequences I've already experienced around this, and this additional level of what I think I have to do to get what I want. So all of these rules are contextually valuable for creating a personal environment and experience for the way that we choose behaviors and move through the world. In this context, there's nothing wrong with them. They're just a part of the way that we understand the world, just like RFT. However, they run the risk of getting us into trouble. So imagine this network. Frame 1, and we're doing, this is a little RFT mixed in with some rules. Frame 1, happiness is better than emotional pain. Frame 2, avoiding feelings is better than feeling sad. Frame 3, feeling sad is worse than feeling anxiety. And frame 4, if I feel sad or anxious, I am not as healthy as everyone around me. So we take that kind of language and those kinds of frames, and we think with just those 4 pieces of information, we can make a network as big as the Simpsons picture that we had. And there's a whole lot of inferred rules then. If these things are better and worse, and this is an example of who I am, then that's going to have a pretty significant impact on our behaviors. And this can lead to some really specific rules. If this is all true, if this is my relational frame, then my rule-governed behaviors, I should be happy. And something is wrong with me when I'm not. And maybe I should hide or ignore or avoid this defect if this is something that isn't as good as something else. And then you wrap that up into sort of wanting to be compliant or make other people feel okay. And we can really find how we as humans fall into this trap of experiential avoidance. And experiential avoidance is this really human attempt to control or alter the painful thoughts and feelings. And we're using these rules to manage the distress, but we're ending up really in this pattern of feeling stuck with this idea of control possibly working or keeping it away from us. So this is what's known as excessive rule-governed behavior. And so again, contextually, rules are not a problem, but when they get excessive, what happens is they become more potent and more front and central than any direct experience. So without direct experience, the rules run the risk of becoming rigid and inflexible. And if we don't get feedback from the environment, especially when we control or limit the environment, then all we have are these rules, and we continue to narrow our repertoire because this is the only information we have, and we're not taking in other information to challenge this idea that I should do everything I can to avoid pain because pain is bad and not as good as all these other things. And the inherent challenge in addition to that is that brains are stubborn. So even when we get feedback, we really have a hard time making room for it. This is known as memory monitoring. So we have these fallibilities of the brain, such as confirmation bias and over magnification, and even the principles of assimilation versus accommodation. The brain really struggles once we get into this really inflexible, excessive, rule-governed way of thinking to allow information around us to challenge that. And so I had to put in Steve Hayes' picture of the emotional avoidance detour. We have this idea that RFT plus inflexible RGBs equals EA. How's that for a nice algorithm? This idea of how we get stuck in emotional avoidance. And we see this idea known as contingency insensitivity, like how I'm sneaking in all these RFT phrases. Contingency is just a future event which is possible but not certain, which has risk. And if we know that risk can be painful, and we have these rules about how to avoid risk, then it's going to be really difficult for us to be willing to come into contact with contingency. So part of being in that emotional detour is getting locked down in this idea of having contingency insensitivity. So really understanding, how we get there. And this is really how they came up with the ACT model of inflexibility. So we all know the hexaflex, and I know we've moved to the 3 pillars, but I learned the hexaflex. And so this psychological inflexibility is this idea of the way that we relate and have these rules, and we end up with a lot of experiential avoidance and inaction or impulsivity or lack of clarity. We know the hexaflex. So that's what we understand. And that's where metaphors can be so wonderfully supportive, because the good news is that humans have this embedded way of speaking and understanding the world. We have this universal natural experience that when we encounter something new, we always interpret it in relation to something that's already known. And so this is a way to create a lot of contact with contingencies without too much pressure and too much fear. So Nicholas, this is from his RFT book, but if you haven't read his new book on metaphors, it's also lovely. But this is a quote from his book on the function of clinical metaphors, which is that metaphoric language transfers functions, this is more RFT, from one experiential field to another. So you link a network of connections with another network, which swiftly opens up new possibilities, both internal, can I think in a different way, and external, so acting differently than usual. So this is a really powerful and effective tool to challenge some of these excessive rule-governed patterns. So this is a great video from the ACT in Action of using metaphor to come into contact with a little bit of discomfort and pain. So let's take a look at this one.
I should be happy. I mean, when I first realized that, other people didn't look as sad as I felt.
Okay.
I mean, it just kind of...
Hear the
I should
rules.
feel in another way. Have you ever been in a cinema?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay. And do you know how it is if you are in a film? So that you cry when the actors are crying, that you laugh when the actors are laughing,
Mm-hmm.
that you kind of are shocked when something suddenly appears on the screen. Do you know that experience?
There's that network.
When you are in a film.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And do you know also the experience when you are sitting in front of the stage and the film or the television and just looking at the film?
Mm-hmm.
And
like kind of not in
looking
it.
around in your room and saying, oh, there are the other people, there are there's the furniture, or there are the windows. In cinema, there are the rows of people, and you're looking at that film. Okay, difference. What might it be when the story that you told me about your life, the story that grows around this theme of I must be happy, I should be happier. Something like a film. You are captured in. Rather than something you look at, or you, rather than being captured in it, go with it.
I don't know. I'm not sure what that would be like.
And that is just really such a wonderful way of being willing to let the shared ground be anything. I know that as clinicians, we want them to be like, oh, right, I can do it differently. But it doesn't usually happen that way. We're grappling with some long-standing narratives about how to handle really intense information. And so this moment to get at this aha is really amazing and lovely, and I think rather vulnerable for all of us in the room, because we often have I'm gonna go to this other slide. Here it is. We have these rules in therapy, and thinking about the way that we're looking at rule-governed behavior in our clients' lives, it's important to stop and take a minute and think about, whoa, what are our rules? Some of the rules that we learn when we're trained is this idea that we're supposed to be able to fix the problem and reduce pain and suffering and always have the answers. And that's not at all what's going on. And then for some of us, when we get into the ACT model, no, we're actually taught that we need to show vulnerability and we need to model contact with the present moment. And so we're really asking ourselves, like, what are our rules? And then also, how can we navigate those rules and also track what's going on in the room? And so I think this is just incredible that he was able to not be too shocked with whatever she gets and really allow her to be curious and allow her to be a little bit resistant, because I think that that's a really valuable piece. And we all know and love the lovely Emily. This was when she was a grad student. Now she's an amazing mid-career person. So let's go back to that big slide and let's continue to kind of navigate. So we had took away all the sort of intense stuff. And I know this is going back to the finger trap, but I just want to look at it conceptually. We have the metaphor, we have the topic, and we have the vehicle. That's along the top. And then along the bottom, we also had that shared ground. And in this example, what's happening is he's really challenging her in a very curious, respectful way to start tracking some of her rules around managing, both the rules around how she's supposed to feel and also how she handles when she doesn't feel like she's supposed to feel that way. So he's really advocating for some tracking. And is there a more workable choice? And using this neutral subject, whether it's the finger trap or the movie theater, is giving some perspective. And it's really giving an opportunity in the room to come into contact with a little bit of contingency, right? A little bit of a potential, little risky, not quite sure what's going to happen, but coming back into the moment more so than just staying in the rules. And then along the left, what's going on here is a functional analysis. And the functional analysis here is that the struggle, whether it's the struggle with life, whether it's the struggle with the toy, whether it's the struggle with fusion, is part of the functional sequence to feeling stuck. So we're really creating this connection. That's where that idea of the causal relationship with, oh, you guys can't see, I'm literally pointing at my screen. But the causal relationship there is this idea that you're helping them to see this framework, that there is this rule that struggle is a part of this functional sequence to feeling stuck. And then there's this self rule, like, do I keep struggling? What's my story? Do I have a rule that I have to try harder? Do I have a rule that I give up? Do I have a rule that I just keep doing what I'm doing and I don't think about it? So we're really creating a connection between what our behavioral space, and again, behavioral, both what's going on in the mind as well as what can be observable, and then what our rules are. And then over here on the right, it's not in her slide, and I guess there's only so much you can fit in a slide, is this information that's being directly relayed, which is there is an alternative, and it's counterintuitive. You lean in at the moment that your body wants to struggle. And from there, that's the opportunity for the client to take that information and consider what that might mean across here in terms of an alternative rule or an alternative choice. We'll come back to that if you guys have questions, because I feel like these slides are the most complicated. So the really important piece that we're seeing throughout these videos is that the therapeutic stance is very important, and that we're modeling tracking in the room. So we really want to go with all interpretations. We don't fight or convince or confess. And I think that was probably the biggest learning curve for me as an early career person using these metaphors, is that I really wanted to do drop the rope, and I wanted the person's eyes to light up and be like, I get it, I'm never picking up the rope again. And I would often, at the moment when I would most need that to happen, is the moment when the person would be like, nope, that's not working for me. And I think it's really important that that's still an effective use of metaphor, because then you can have this conversation about what their rules are without using that kind of jargon, and really being able to dig deeper. Tell me more about that. What is that experience like? So the therapist needs to be willing to stay with the function and the process and resist the urge to go in or after content. And I think that last video, he just did a remarkable job of just staying with the function and process and letting her be in the moment. So this next metaphor is let's imagine you're sitting in the room and your client's talking of, you've got an adolescent and they're talking about their mom, and you say, oh, she's a tiger mom. And you're thinking, great, we got a metaphor. We can use this to, create some shared ground. Why might that not work? She is a tiger mom. Because in that situation, we're not giving any topic or shared ground or opportunity for curiosity. We're actually prescribing something. And if you look at this slide, if you're on the phone, there's 3 very different interpretations of what this might mean. In the top left, you've got the kids acting like circus animals, and the mom is literally in the ring of the circus, running them around. On the right hand, it's more of a shared collaborative approach where everybody is gaining, sort of value-added benefits from the tiger mom, because she's overlooking them practicing the piano and the violin. And in the bottom, the girl has a tutu on, a helmet, and a musical instrument. And then the mom's carrying the backpack and dragging her across to her next event. So there's all these interpretations, and we didn't allow it to come up. And so we don't know which one is the one that they're going to come up with. And the other piece is that if we go back to this idea of pliance, we're also running the risk of setting it up where they're not even going to tell us what they really think is the version that popped into their head, because they're going to be conflicted about trying to guess what we want it to be. So this is an example of best intentions with a metaphor, but if we don't create this open stance of curiosity, could it be like, what if it was like this? When you think of a tiger mom, what comes up for you? We end up getting in our own version of kind of rule governed behavior. So we really want to watch that, and we all do it. So then we want to watch and know how to correct it or honor it or understand it with the client, but we really want to work towards more of an open stance. And a nice example, quote around this in the 1999 book is that the use of metaphor increases the proportion of client, and I put and clinician behavior, that is under the control of tracks, which you remember is defined as having natural consequences in the room. And therefore, the functional value of the behavior is directly targeted. So we really want to make sure that when we use metaphor, we're not prescribing or dropping accidentally into our rules or their rules, or our rules about their rules or their rules about our rules. What we really want, and this language came up earlier, is a transformation. We want a transformation of the function that is not directly taught or reinforced or expected. And so the way that we do that is that we don't just say it is, we say, could it be that it is like this? And we have this function that when you have a finger trap, it's counterintuitive. You lean in instead of fighting it. And we hope that there is a transformation where they infer on their own that they can transfer that information and transform the function that they have, which is, no, I have to keep struggling or I have to give up. And the way that we do that is in relational framing, we provide contextual cues. We don't tell them, we provide these cues for them to transfer this information on their own. And in metaphor and in RFT, the C, this is called C real, and you'll see that on that slide, and you'll see it in RFT. What that means is it's a contextual cue for a relationship. REL is for a relationship. That's why it's pronounced C real rather than, I'm going to admit it, I'm just going to say it, I called it Krell. And so it's okay. It's C real. And it's this cue for the relationship to be reinforced. And again, this creates some vulnerability as the clinician, because they may transform, they may not, or they may transform it in a way that we don't expect. And what we like to believe in a contextual framework is that that's all really valuable, because any opportunity for looking at things in a different framework is promoting psychological flexibility. So let's take a look at this next video. This is a little bit longer, but it's just a lovely rendition of a pretty classic ACT metaphor. It's a little bit of a variation on what Russ was doing with his hands, but you can see it has a slightly different intention, but it is also about sense of self and fusion.
Sound all right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm intrigued. So
he just asked permission, which is another great thing.
For a moment that this book here is all sort of the real ugly stuff that we've been talking about in the previous two sessions, the real painful sort of critical thoughts that you've had about yourself, feeling like failure, some of those difficult memories that you spoke about, the previous experiences you've had that are quite sort of traumatic. And also just some of the urges and the anxieties that come up for you from day to day. Yeah. So unfortunately, I'll pass this on to you. So imagine they're with you, and hold on to it quite tight. Okay. Because these are sort of part of you, an aspect of you. And just before we start, do you have any neck or shoulder sort of injuries? Okay. No. Okay. That's all good. It just requires a bit of resistance. Sure. So if you could just hold those thoughts, memories, urges that the book represents just up against your nose, if you will. Like this? Yeah. Closer even. That's it. Okay, right up there. Now, John, what's it like, engaging with me, having a conversation with me when I speak to you?
What, with it up against my nose?
Yeah.
It feels weird.
Okay, yeah.
Distracting, annoying.
All right. Can you see my face? And, let's say I was doing a silly little jig or a dance. Like, would you be able to, enjoy that? Or?
Well, depends on how quality the dancing was. But no, certainly I wouldn't be able to see it.
See how he rolls with that.
So what's it like being absorbed in all that sort of the negative thoughts and memories and emotions?
Oh, it's not pleasant. It feels like it's the only thing that's going on.
Okay. And what if your baby's sort of down here, looking a bit upset, looking like maybe she wants to be burped or fed? Do you think you'd be able to notice that?
No, it's it.
Okay. So how does that make you feel? I think that was important to you, being able to be a good father.
Oh yeah, certainly. Oh, it just feels like I have no out. I'm stuck.
Okay, and you say, if you're at home, your partner's face, and would you be able to engage with her if, she was asking you a question or sharing a story with you?
I mean, I'd certainly perhaps hear some of it, but I'd be distracted with what's in front of my face.
Okay, yeah. So it's a little difficult being caught up and absorbed in those thoughts to truly engage in the present moment and really take in some of the good aspects that are there and be present. So let's try something different. Now I want you to push those thoughts and feelings and memories away. Just push them towards me, because we don't want them. They're unpleasant, they're uncomfortable, and they give us a lot of suffering, really. So just push it away towards me. Yeah, really get into it. Use those biceps. That's it. And triceps. So, all right. So, oh, geez, they're pretty strong. Okay. So, real, get stuck into that. Yeah, because we want to. This is kind of a bit like what you've been telling me. You've been doing. You've been struggling. You've been trying to push this away. You don't want this. And I think you were telling me, you've sort of tried a lot of things to get rid of some of these negative thoughts, feelings, urges, memories. Mentioned the alcohol use. Trying harder and harder, reading more sort of self-help books, working harder at the gym, etc. What's it like struggling against these?
Oh, it's certainly effortful, and I can my arms already starting to tire a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm getting fed up.
So there's a bit of a cost physically. Yeah, it's draining on you. Yeah, and your energy levels.
I feel like they're getting exhausted.
Okay, and I noticed at the start of the session you said this stuff's been going on for years.
Yeah.
So, we've been going for about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So, just take a minute to think about what it's like to be struggling like you have for years like this, and the energy.
Oh yeah, it's a big waste.
What could you be using that energy to do? Do you think?
Spend time with my wife and son.
Okay. So let's try something a little different then. Oh, by the way, when your hands are up there like that, can you actually hug your son?
Oh well, yeah, no. I mean,
or your partner, or can you work as effectively as you'd like? Type away on the keyboard, write an email.
No, I mean they're holding the book.
Yeah,
they're holding.
What about, go to the gym or stuff like that. So you're caught up a little bit more. Yeah, it seems you're less able to engage in some of the things that in your heart's deepest desire you really value and you'd like to do.
This is the only thing I can do at the moment.
Okay, it's getting pretty tough.
Yeah, my arm is starting to feel.
Sorry.
No, you're right.
So just whack that on your lap now.
Okay.
So something a little bit different. So you'll notice that the thoughts, the memories, they're still there.
Yep.
And in many ways, they're closer to you than they have been, when they were touching up on just near the nose, and when you're pushing away. In many ways, this is the closest there. They're touching the skin, and they're still there. But how is it having a conversation with me now?
Well, I mean, it's obviously less noticeable. It's on my lap.
So you're sort of not as entangled.
Yeah,
sort of with them. You're sort of more present.
Oh, I certainly feel, physically much more comfortable, but they're still here though, which is something which I don't really want. I'd much rather just perhaps if we could.
Do that. Sure.
That would be
I think wouldn't we all just love to just throw this away? And I think in many ways, I think what we found is that the mind works a little differently to sort of physical world when we want to cut something out. Say if a piece of furniture is not right, just sand it back, just chop it out. But the mind seems to work a little differently, and I think that could be what we're sort of seeing with some of those strategies, like the drinking, sort of working harder, reading more books. They might have a beneficial effect in the short term, but it seems like over the years, it's not long before they pop back up again.
It's been there the whole time.
Have you noticed that?
But it's a case of, there are certain things I do try to do, but I'm here today.
Sure.
So,
and I suppose that's what ACT's about. It's maybe there's another way. There's another way to relate to these thoughts, these feelings, a way in which you open up and you're more accepting, and your arms are free to sort of do what you want, to have that sort of to know what matters and act in a sort of a way that's.
Oh, I'm not sure what cut off there, but I think we got the gist. So he does some really wonderful things in there. he starts by using some language of you can't do some things, and he tracks really well that the client says, well, I could try. And I think that there's that moment where we see that in our clients, where our clients go, well, I can get by. And instead of challenging that, he meets the client where he is, and he says, okay, so you're less able to do it. And that was a really gentle way of really tracking whatever shared ground was going to happen around that moment. And then he also used a lot of language of, it could be like this. Is it possible? Really letting the client decide and giving them permission to have whatever opinion, rather than, sort of some accidental compliance going on there. I think the other piece about this metaphor is how wonderful that it's just a symbol of the pain, but as soon as it's on his lap, he has a visceral experience and he wants to get it away. And that's not necessarily what you always get, but it's a pretty powerful thing when you do it. And it doesn't matter whether the clinician was expecting to use that as a part of the metaphor. Again, he was tracking in that moment, and he really normalized that and really, kind of did some control is the problem, not the solution, in a really, well, yeah, of course, who wouldn't? And here's the problem with that, is that minds don't really let us do that. So I think on many levels, it's just a lovely example. This is one of my favorite go-tos when you have somebody that comes to you that says, oh, I've tried all the other therapies. How is ACT different? Because it gives them a sense of what the experience is going to be like in the room, and it gives them this visceral kinesthetic information, and it packs a lot in under 10 minutes. So this is a great go-to at the front end if you're just kind of wanting to do a little bit of here's how it could be different than some of the other things. Okay, so I guess this is where I put this before. It's never hurts to talk about it again when you're using metaphor and sitting in a contextual framework. Just always remembering that we are also tracking everything that they're doing and everything that we're doing. So we have our own private events, we have our own relational frames, we have our own rule governed behavior, and we are human, so we know that we also have our own excessive rule governed behavior. And so we really practice and work on finding a way to pay attention to that as well, and oftentimes being able to pause and say, oh yeah, I'm having a moment where I was taking our conversation and I was up here with it, and using that metaphor to model the information can be really powerful. Okay, so I can't remember whether I queued this up or not, but I wanted to share DJ's talking on a podcast about using the metaphor of jumping off the paper. This is another lovely metaphor that, again, is experiential, can be very effective I've done it in groups, individual, I've even done it with couples. This was really interesting, where they, again, kind of decided for themselves whether they were jumping together or separately. But I am, maybe I did queue it up. We'll see what we got. That sounds like the podcast is not where it needs to be.
Sales, and her house became so good job making specific.
I'm gonna try to.
Like, you learn.
Oh yeah, I think I got it.
Freaking out about what they want their life to be about. You say to yourself, well, I can't really talk about values till 7. That's not that,
Let me just say that I would never advocate for that. He's very fluid. I'm doing an OCD.
I gotta back it up a little bit.
And we've talked a little bit about the fact that much of the empirically supported intervention to bring into the specific diagnosis counts as committed action, along with whatever homework assignments we give at the end of each session. So why don't you take us a little bit further into how you bring committed action, into the therapy room with your clients, building on what you've already said. There's, for example, for my 2 exact for OCD protocol, there definitely is sort of a section 7 and 8, which deals with values and committed action, and you basically do the values assessment, and then you you start talking about what types of goals or behavior that they can engage in going forward to deal with, for example, their OCD. But my guess is that you would do some of that in ACT, DJ, but maybe there are some other areas or key ways that you integrate committed action into the setting. So
I'll talk about a couple of things, and I'll try to make them succinct. But the first thing I want to react to is that I think in Mike Twig's work, and I love Mike. He and I wrote a chapter together with Steve. Have a very good time talking to him at every convention. He's an amazing scientist. He's young and he's published so much that's so erudite and scholarly. He's a hero. He's a rock star. And I want to clarify, if people read his work, I don't think I could say that we would do values work or committed action in session 7. It's not, and I'm not even saying that you're saying that. I'm just in case a listener might have misinterpreted. If you're doing fluid therapy for a client who wants to change their behavior, forming this therapeutic relationship, and the idea of the therapeutic relationship is to change behavior, I'd say rarely are you going to codify what to do in which session so far ahead, because you want to be flexible with what shows up in the first session. I mean, if the person is bringing to you that they're freaking out about what they want their life to be about, you say to yourself, well, I can't really talk about values till session 7. That's not ACT,
Let me just say that Mike would never advocate for that. He's very fluid. I'm doing an OCD outcome study.
All right. Well, that's not the that's not the metaphor that I wanted. Although I really love what he was saying, and that fits what we're talking about, which is whether it's a metaphor or committed action, a diffusion, whatever you think you're going to walk into the room with, you want to hold that very lightly, and you want to track with what's going on in the room. However, if you listen to the ACT in Action podcast, this was obviously the one on committed action, and you can go find somewhere around that, and I'll track it and fix it for Dublin. He talks about jumping off the piece of paper, and what he talks about is the value of making sure that you ask permission. Would you be willing to try this exercise with me? Let's see how this metaphor fits with what we're talking about. And if you're not familiar with that metaphor, it's about using a piece of paper to imagine that you're standing on the edge of a cliff, or sometimes if that's too panic inciting for people, I'll use jumping off the high dive, and really coming into contact with all of the mechanics and the experience of literally jumping off the piece of paper. And then if they're willing, you have them jump and you dismantle what that experience is like. And one of my favorite things about this metaphor is that it pulls for such diverging responses, and they're all really great at really highlighting psychological flexibility. So you'll have somebody that says, nope, that didn't work for me. There's no part of me that thought that was anything other than a piece of paper. And then the beautiful response of shared ground is, wow, look at the power of the mind to really stay grounded and be aware of what's happening in the room. What allowed you to do that? Help me to know about those active ingredients. And then you'll have the person that was like, I couldn't jump. I was so nauseated. I was dizzy. I had these visceral experiences. So very different. But again, this flexibility of, wow, look at the power of the brain. It has the power to create this reality that on the one hand, you know you're on a piece of paper, but everything felt as though you were really standing on the edge of a cliff. So that's a really lovely one. And he just does a great job of talking about being curious and not demanding that there's any right way of doing it. So I am sorry that I didn't cue it up, but I'll make a note for Dublin. So this comes to the section of kind of just looking at the overall guidelines for choosing metaphors. And so what we want is, we've got 5 guidelines for how do we optimally choose what to do, when to do around using clinical metaphors in the room. And the first one is that we want the metaphor to match as closely as possible with the situation faced by the client. So that's that cue. We want to create a contextual cue that there's a relationship of coordination. So an example of that, there's a classic example of anxiety is like quicksand. And that's a classic in the relationship of struggling and feeling as though you're getting sucked under with anxiety. And so there's a coordination where fighting with anxiety is like fighting with quicksand. And there's a lot of evidence that that's matched very closely and can be very effective. So what's really lovely about this ACT community is that there's all these ACT protocols. In fact, in that last podcast, they were talking about the protocol for OCD. And I think what they were both trying to say isn't that that protocol is really inflexible, but that protocol has done the research on what metaphors are matched as closely as possible with the experience of OCD. And he also does stuff with Trick, and then we've got the metaphors. And that's where the different books are really valuable, because they use the metaphors that are most closely associated with the different diagnostic classifications. You don't need to buy the books. One of the most amazing things about this community is that you can go on to the contextualpsychology.org website and look at a lot of these protocols and learn about them that way. I'm not saying don't buy books. I'm just saying that you don't have to. Someone's joining, so I'm just saying. So that's a really nice piece to remember. You know, I feel as though in our world we're moving more into a trans-diagnostic way of looking at things. And so I actually adhere to that world, so I don't want to get too caught up in diagnostic groups, but I think it's really important to think about the contextual cue of the relationship, that's the C real, needs to be one of coordination. So really matching it is an important piece. Number 2, the metaphor aims to modify behavior. We're not just using language to communicate, we're using it to modify behavior, but we're not using it to modify a specific behavior, because that would be rule governed. We are using it to have the intention of providing an alternative behavior, because we're thinking in this framework that there's excessive rule governed behavior that's limiting contact with contingencies or natural consequences. And we want to be able to get them that contact, but we want them to create the transformation. We want them to make that inference on their own, so that that's not rule governed, that it's something that's natural to their experience. So in that area, that topic then is an inflexible, rigid behavior that interferes with committed action. So a nice example of that is the metaphor of the tug of war. And I highly recommend that you go to your local climbing store and buy some rope, because I once did the tug of war with a woman's bag and it ripped. And she was great about it, but get yourself some rope. Okay, and so number 3, we talked a little bit about this with the chessboard, but the metaphor needs to be something that the person currently understands. And it's really easy to map on. It doesn't have to be that they know all the nuances of chess. They just need to understand the nuances of a 2-person board game where there is 2 sides that are competing against each other and a board underneath. And so really thinking about, so if I have student athletes at the counseling center, then I, almost always go for their sport and their metaphor. And it's a really powerful thing. Even in the Boulder community at large, there's a lot of competitive athletes here. And so that's a very easy metaphor for them. So not only understand it, but sort of speaks to their repertoire and is relevant and important to them. Metaphors need to be memorable so that they can be portable and reusable. So plan on referencing them over time. An excellent example of that is the passengers on the bus. 4 sessions down the line, 10 sessions down the line, it's pretty amazing. All of a sudden the client will be like, oh, I see who is driving the bus. And it's in there, and it's really wonderful as a way to drop back into some tracking and drop back into some sort of curiosity about alternative behaviors. And then number 5, consider picking a few favorites and becoming very comfortable with them rather than trying to master them all. One of the most amazing things that the ACT community did was come out with this big book of metaphors, and it gives people a little bit of analysis paralysis. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't possibly remember all of those. And there's nothing, well, I could maybe think of a few things that are worse. It's pretty painful as a clinician when you're in the room and you're in the middle of a metaphor and you can't remember where it goes. And that's, and again, it's a great opportunity to model humanity and humility, but it's also something that if you just consider picking a few favorites and becoming very comfortable with them, then you can avoid that experience. The other thing that that does is it really limits what is affectionately known as metaphor abuse. Metaphor abuse is when you listen to your tape later on and you realize that you dropped in like 15 different metaphors. We're human, it happens, but it's also something that we work really hard as we continue to fine tune our skills to stick with just one and carry it all the way through, rather than having a bunch that can be a bit jumbled and confused. So let's come back to this original slide. And I think my hope is that it won't feel quite as overwhelming and confusing as it did at the beginning. So I haven't added anything. This is her slide, but I think it's really lovely that all this stuff is starting to make sense. So up at the top, she has an arbitrary C-reel for coordination. So what we know about that is that it is an arbitrary relation, which means that it is a choice relationship rather than one based on science or logic, that we're cueing a relationship of coordination. All metaphors are coordinating because we're not necessarily asking them to compare, we're asking them to use that information to coordinate opportunity to do something different. So that's what that means at the top. Across the middle, they're equivalent and causal. That goes back to that framework of coordination, and we want the information on the right to be equivalent to the information on the left. So if I'm struggling with the toy and struggle is not getting me out of the toy, and you introduce this information that there's an alternative behavior other than struggle, then that's equivalent and causal over here, where I can consider, it's up to me, it's my shared ground, whether or not I'm going to transfer that information, in which case then the stimulus is the function is transformed, where I start to think about and challenge my rules that maybe I could do something other than struggle or give up. And that's the transformation where I'm thinking, oh, I could maybe do something different. So hopefully that slide feels a little less intimidating. It's actually kind of interesting to think about how in the world they figured all of that out. I have a lot of respect for the RFT scientists. So it's about 7:30. What I like to do at this point when I'm doing this live is to actually do as a group the passengers on the bus metaphor. That's why I set up what I did at the beginning about willingness and vulnerability, to think about what people might do and talk about. And I'd still like to try that, even though it's on a webinar, and I think it could get a little more cacophonous, but that's part of passengers on the bus. But I think what I'd like to do before that, and this was just in case we can watch Stephen Hayes do it, is look at the comments, because I've been staring at myself for an hour and a half and I haven't gotten any empathic head nods or any comments, good, bad, or otherwise. So I'm going to look at the chat and see if there's some questions. Okay. Yeah, so there's some muting. So let's see. About these questions. And at this point, if anybody wants to unmute and talk, I'd love to hear somebody else's voice besides myself. And I think we can handle talking. And if not, think about the bus metaphor and I will just look at answers. So it looks like I was a little choppy. Oh, bummer. Yeah, see, I don't think those are my sounds, because I created a very quiet room and made everyone in my household be on a different floor. Some of the video audio was poor, it's inconsistent. Uh-oh, was I garbled the whole time?
No.
Oh, good.
I think it was just the videos that you were showing. A couple of them were garbled.
All right.
When you're done reading through them, I do have a question, but I can certainly wait.
Oh yeah, no, and I can go in and look and make sure that the volume is the highest. I was hearing a lot of background noise, which wasn't mine, but I wonder if there was a effect where I was hearing it and then you guys were hearing it. But I will make sure that the volume is something that we look at. And so people were asking where the videos were. So, and I love if you guys can see, this is, when I first did this, it was 10 years ago. And so I had to take the Act in Action DVDs. Yes, I had the DVDs, and then I had to burn them to my computer, and then I had to embed them because I didn't have Wi-Fi at the time. When I was going to the conference, it wasn't in all the rooms. So a lot of those are the Act in Action DVDs, and then there's one that is from Act in a Nutshell, and then of course Russ Harris is one from YouTube. But I am certainly happy to put that. I haven't yet gotten that into my references, but I will, because those are interesting. I don't know whether you can find the Act in Action videos on YouTube, because they were for sale at the time. And I did purchase them. I just used them for educational purposes. And I don't know if any of them were from the Learning Act videos, because the Learning Act videos are the ones with the curtain in the background, because we always make fun, like, did they not have funding? But I'm pretty sure they're all Act in Action, and then one from Act in a Nutshell. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe what we could do is on our end, we could mute all of everybody. Sorry about that. All right, so questions. Let's talk about questions.
I have one. This is Sarah. Let's see if I can be articulate about it. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
Sounds
so
great.
I'm relatively new to ACT, and I'm interested in using metaphors with my clients, but I've heard in various places, including the podcast, that sometimes they don't go over very well in terms of them coming across as sort of lame or hokey. And a lot of my clients are sort of young and edgy, and so I've been hesitant to use them. Hearing you talk about how useful they are, I could see how someone could find it lame in the moment, but then be able to still internalize it and apply it. And I'm wondering if you have experience with that particular quandary, and whether there are certain metaphors that are sort of more easily digested by people that are cynical.
Yeah, well, I think that's a phenomenal question. I think that's an excellent question. And I think on the clinician end, the first time that you do anything experiential, anytime you get up out of your seat or you introduce something that's not just words going back and forth, it can feel pretty vulnerable. And I think that's the piece where, again, with that jumping off the cliff slide, being willing to model that, and in your, and this is the other piece about style. So there's no right way to put that in the room, but it's really honoring your own style. So what I have found, and this is what I learned from ACBS. So let's just say I don't have any original material. I've just gotten it all from all these amazing ACBS people. When I first started going to conferences in the World Conference, what I noticed was this theme. And there was this theme that all of the big presenters, Robin Walser and Kelly Wilson and Stephen Hayes, and they all started an opener with something that was incredibly vulnerable about themselves. And that set the tone for modeling vulnerability. And it really, talk about transforming willingness in the room. It really created this incredible community that you still feel, even though the conferences have gotten so much bigger. So I think as a clinician, what you want to do is find this level where you're honoring this is a risk, but you are also at the same time not putting it down. So I think the thing that I would avoid saying is, oh, let's do this lame exercise. I'm sure you're going to find it lame, because then we're getting into the rule governed kind of experience. But I think if we model, hey, I'd really like to try something different, and I'll do it with you. We're in it together. My language that I usually say is some people can find it kind of silly, but even, and sometimes especially when it's silly, something really different shows up. So let's just see what happens. And then what you're also modeling is that we're going after process rather than any specific content. And where I feel like clinicians inadvertently want to talk about these rules, hide behind, oh, it's lame, I'm not going to do it, it's too risky, is when we really expect a certain outcome. And I learned that the hard way. I guess I just missed that workshop, but I went in first thinking that people were going to drop the rope and that people were going to know that they couldn't dig themselves out. And I really like in that last video, he's like, well, I can kind of do the things that I need to do, because that's very realistic. And I think the best thing you can do, in addition to coming out like, this could be, I'm not sure how this is going to go, but I really want to give it a try because I think there's something important, even if it's silly, is to really, truly be prepared for anything. If you end up having the complete opposite and the person really digs in deeper, I still think that's a successful moment, because now you're sitting in it with them and there can be this openness about what it feels like to feel stuck. So I think that one of the ways that is great is to practice and rehearse these. And when I used to do this in a 3-hour workshop back in the day, the best thing we did was practice these and really have people be as honest as possible. And so when they said something contrary, if you will, stopping and pausing, we would do it in threes, and we would have these lifelines like, what is the flexible, psychologically flexible response to somebody being dug in or having resistance? And that practice really helped feeling ready and prepared to take on anything. But I know that my clinical practice was transformed when I took that risk and started using metaphors for all ages,
I think too, and I learned something today in terms of trying to explain the metaphor, the very, very basic. And I haven't used it before, but this concept of all hands on deck, I think will work really well because obviously we know that people aren't putting their hands on the deck of a ship, when we hear that. And I've used metaphors effectively for a long time, but there is a whole group of people who really, really struggle with them. And I wonder if, because there's a cultural thing, whereas I come from a different country to where I work, and the metaphors that I've been brought up with are quite different to the metaphors here. So I've had to learn over time how to explain that they're embedded in our culture. So that for me has been the key thing, because otherwise people look at you like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that. And I think my goal in kind of deconstructing that there's a topic and a shared ground is this idea that if you're in a culture where none of these are going to be effective, then you've got the components to create your own. You can even do that in, sometimes with my engineers and my physicists, like they love this language, and they're like, okay, here's my topic and here's my shared ground, and they create it. And that's amazing. But the idea here is that it's infinite, and you can just take these, I got my shared ground, what is my intention, what's my topic going to be, how does it fit in with my culture? And it's way more effective than anything that you could be told. That's awesome.
Colleen, if you don't mind me, can you guys hear me? This is Carrie Makenbird.
Hi, Carrie.
Hello, Sam. I thought that was such a beautiful point about, and the irony is, I think some of my favorite metaphors that I have brought in that are not traditional ACT ones are ones I have heard from friends from other countries, because I think it can sometimes introduce a level of novelness. Like I'm trying to think not my circus, not my monkeys.
Oh, nice.
The first pancake is always a lump is another one of my favorite ones. But I think it's such a beautiful illustration of across cultures. Sometimes, even if you've never heard it before, there is like Colleen, you so beautifully said, this opportunity to offer a shared ground and then see where it goes.
Yeah. And again, I just love that we're sitting here talking with people all over the world, and that we can find this common language. And again, hoping that understanding the RFT underneath that will help us to continue to, you know, all move together, even though the specifics are going to look a little different. Other questions? I feel like there was one in there about RFT, but now I don't see it. Function transformation. Did you guys need me to unpack that a little bit more? Well, look at that. I mean, I guess I will, just to say, you know, again, we're always looking at the function of the behavior. Why are any of us at any point doing whatever we're doing? And being able to use metaphors to increase flexibility, opportunity, that's the transformation. Other stories about, you know, challenges around using metaphors? We can talk about how amazing they are, but maybe it would be valuable to talk about challenges.
Colleen, I'd be interested in hearing you talk more about, especially when you're working with people who are beginning and our therapists are getting pretty concrete or rigid about the metaphor. What are some of the ways that you kind of scaffold and facilitate easing up or flexibly responding when a clinician's in a place of, but I need to convince you of this?
Yes, yes, yes. We see this with our early career trainees. This and also, I don't know if you guys have had that experience too. Not only is there inflexibility in that moment, but again, kind of what DJ was saying, you know, coming in and being like, I failed, I didn't get the agenda for session 4. And it's like, whoa, you know, that there's so much, you know, sort of rule governed inflexibility around that. So my favorite go-to for that is Sonia Batten's article on the role of emotion in supervision. I do a presentation for the trainees on that, and she and, you know, Robin and Dara have these awesome conferences around supervision and how to have this conversation, knowing that there's a hierarchy, knowing that you're a position in power, or as a trainee, you're under there. So there's gonna be that pliance already that we wanna be aware of, and not ignoring or trying to get rid of that hierarchy, but working in the context of it, but also creating a safe environment. And so I think that's the platform that really helps to have that conversation. So if you guys haven't read it, there's 2 articles. They did 2 versions, and the most recent is 2009, and it's literally called The Role of Emotion in Supervision. And you can always, you all have my email, so I can always send it to you. But it's this nice way of how to respectfully know that that's going to set you up. And I think I try to model, you know, this is kind of the human experience. It's that 2 mountain metaphor, that whether you're talking about it in supervision or talking about it as a clinician or talking about it as a client, we're all just human. And really staying curious and open, help me to understand what the function is about what you're doing. And then let's think, what would be a good metaphor around inflexibility of the metaphor for the clinician? Because we could use a metaphor to catch that. Yeah. Anyone got one? No? Well, I'll have to think about that and send that out. I think I obviously don't have one because that's not my go-to, but I kind of think it would be awesome. I definitely go back to the rules. You know, I remember, and they stole my title, because I remember being an early career therapist and sitting with somebody in the room and being like, gosh, this person should really see somebody, and be like, oh, that's me. I'm the person in the room. I'm the one that's supposed to be doing that, and trying to kind of come from that place of, you know, what do you think you're supposed to be doing right now? I think the most difficult piece when we all get inflexible, no matter where we are in our trajectory, is when we feel like it's hard to admit that we feel stuck and that we feel the hopelessness, like we're on that level, we're in the content, And I think that that's something that being able to sort of really be like, we all get pulled into the content. That's the human condition. It's not that we're going to stop doing that, but how do you model with the client in the room and, you know, to kind of identify that and own it and move around it. So sometimes you could use the same metaphor. So I guess, you know, the digging the hole metaphor could be a great one. And you could be like, as the clinician, you could be like, oh my gosh, I just went down the hole, or I just let somebody else drive my bus as I'm sitting here with you. And being able to do that with people that are feeling more inflexible, I think we're giving them permission to sit in that vulnerability. That's hard to do, to sit in that vulnerability. And yet we ask our clients to do that every time they come in the room. Did that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. I was nodding enthusiastically.
Head nodding. I don't have any of the video. I'm trying to show you guys the mountain, so I'm going to pull the view down while you guys ask other questions. Oh, is it still too bright to see it? It might be. There are mountains behind us here in Colorado. So what do you guys think? Do you want to try passengers on the bus? We have about 15 minutes. We could do that. Or if you feel like it's been long enough, I know maybe some of you thought there's no way it's going to go 2 hours. We certainly don't have to. I don't think I have any more. Yep. Yeah, you don't need credit. These are the references. I'll add in the videos. We could do two things. We could, well, here's our three choices. We could end, or we could watch Stephen Hayes do the bus metaphor, or we could unmute and see if we could try for the bus metaphor, which could be a vulnerable flop. Don't all speak at once. All right, since nobody spoke, I'm going to rule out doing the metaphor together because I think unmuting that might just be too great of a risk. But let me tell you, that has always been the scariest part about this workshop, and it has always been the most profoundly rewarding. Every time I do it, I don't know who is shaking more in their boots, me because I'm afraid I'm going to forget it, even though I've been doing it consistently for 18 years, but you just never know. You might just forget it. Or the person who's vulnerable enough to stand in front of a crowd of people. And it's amazing how the audience comes together, whether you move around or in your seats. There's this cacophony of information, and always people come up, both whether they were the person standing up in the front or afterwards, and they are grateful for the experience, for the awareness that showed up when they went to that place. So that bus metaphor is just a phenomenal opportunity to take risk. And I think I usually introduce, you know, like I'm just as uncomfortable as you are, and I think there's something really valuable if we try it. So I highly recommend it, but I understand someone's got to go do avoidance. I love that. So what I'm going to do, just because we have a few more minutes, is just show this last Stephen Hayes video. If you have to go, go. We are so grateful from Impact Psychology here in Colorado that you were willing to spend, well, your evening or your day, depending on where you are. We know that there's so much going on in our lives, so thank you for that. And then I'll just stick around at the end to see if there's any other questions.
Hey, Colleen, can I ask one more question before
Sure.
you do that?
Yeah.
I was wondering about like your light touch and use of humor. I just was noticing that sort of that, for me, that's definitely one way of being flexible and kind of getting myself out of a tight situation. I'm wondering about, I'm guessing that you use humor. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, just because I know you.
Yeah, you know, I mean, and I'm. This is the part where it's hard to not have any feedback. Like, were you guys like, what the, when Steve blew his nose? And it's just like, wow, could you ever do that? And so I think, you know, it's really finding your own style. I feel like humor is a way for me to be vulnerable and as safe of a way as I know how, because I don't want to ever make it about me, but I also want to be a human. And so I think this is the piece, that for you and I, Meg, is so compelling around the ACT model, is it's so human and it's so genuine and it's so authentic. And we want to track in the room that we are flexible and navigating their material, not ours. And so I think that that's, a constant navigation, and that one of the best things we do is really practice our own sense of being mindful to, what is happening for us. And so I think humor for me is sometimes an interjection. Sometimes if I can use the humor to take a pause, then I can sort of check in with myself and be like, am I avoiding anything? Am I putting something off? Do I feel like I should go somewhere else? I think it is also that modeling that I love about the ACBS community, which is I'm not perfect, I'm gonna mess up. And if I can do that with people who are going to teach me to be better, how amazing that is. So it's a way of being able to kind of be human and not take it so seriously. I mean, I think that's one piece. I'd love to find a metaphor. And I really like the metaphors best when there's a client in the room, so you can actually see how they're going to, do whatever they do. But this idea of kind of holding the thoughts lightly. And I feel like the humor is my version of holding things really lightly, sort of a diffusion technique. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you talking about that, because, and I love the piece about the different styles. So I think I was having the thought of sort of that a lot of times the light touch when introducing a metaphor just really helps a person get into it and be flexible with you. So yeah, I love hearing what you're.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's intentional, right? So who we are as therapists is not who we are in our personal world. And that's intentional. That's a lovely boundary. And so thinking about intentionally, what are the things that we want to bring in that are promoting and supporting humanity and psychological flexibility is really the awesome journey.
Yeah. Thank you, Colleen.
Yeah. Any other questions before we get one more? Stephen Hayes. He was just my backup in case I chickened out when I was doing them before. But so far I haven't chickened out, except for tonight. Might be considered a little bit of a chicken. But if you guys, the next time we see each other, we can try it. Okay, so here's a little Stephen Hayes clip.
Last time when we were talking about this sort of issue of control or something, maybe it's kind of like this. If I can just use a metaphor that might kind of a framework for this. It's like you're driving a bus and you're stopping periodically and passengers are getting on. And maybe this is kind of like what life is like a life bus. And these passengers get on. Some of them are painful experiences you've had. Some are happy experiences. Some are difficult thoughts, happy thoughts. It'd be like some of these passengers, like sweet little ladies you really talk to, like you want them to sit up
Only
front.
Steve can do that.
Some of them are not like that. They're frightening. They're threatening. They're mean. They're very intrusive, smelly. It'll be like, somebody comes on, hasn't had a bath for weeks, there's a pain dangling off them or something. And you really don't want those. If you kind of look at what's going on there in the morning, some of those thoughts you don't want. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay. If you were in that situation, it would be the natural thing to say, I just want that one off. And so what would you do in that situation? You're driving along, there it is. What are you going to do?
I guess I just turn around and say, you get off.
That's right. And in fact, you've done that, haven't you?
Yeah.
In fact, you were doing it the other morning.
I guess so.
What does your experience tell you? What then happens? Do they get up and leave?
Maybe for
2 seconds, and then they're right.
But now look at this. Is it they actually left the bus, or you just don't see them? Is it more like they're kind of slunk? It's like they're slipping down. You look back, you don't see them, but it's, you know, just moments later, right?
Yeah, they're hanging around. Yeah, they're still there.
When you really get dedicated to getting some of these things off, like, you don't want to have that thinking there at all. What is that like? Like the periods of time where you've really intensely fought inside your cat, try to clean this up. And it's sort of like stopping us, going back. You called back, they didn't leave. Now we're at the higher level. We're going to throw them bodily off of us. Except if you were actually do that, you'd have to stop the mess. And can you relate to that? That's some of what's been going on here. It's almost as if life's on hold while this war gets fought. Like, if you actually look at the pain you're in right now, you just ask you this.
Oh, well, there goes the end of that one. I was having one more thought about that, which is that's not how I do it. And then I had a little bit of anxiety. Should I be doing it like that? And I think the take-home final message is, if we have shared ground and we're creating and promoting psychological flexibility, it's okay to do it differently. And I just put a little bit more of what would you like to do and have them generate. Sometimes they say they want to throw them off the bus. Sometimes they want to ignore them. Sometimes they want to tell them to shut up. So it's just a slight variation, but I think it's a great take-home message and kind of ending point, which is if you go back to the intention and the guidelines and deconstructing the parts, and it moves you closer to the shared goals that you have, then it's an effective metaphor.
Thank you so much, Colleen. This is super generous of you to do this so that we can all share, those of us who cannot be in Dublin.
Well, it was really fun. So we at Impact Psychology should keep doing this.
You know, last time when we were talking.
Sorry. Okay. I thought I had more slides, but we're good. You don't need credit. So, all right. Well, I know we're out of time, so I'm going to go and stop the recording, and